Hello, usual disclaimer, I won't go on about it, but do read it when you get a chance. Today we're going to talk about the scrutiny of the police and why it's difficult to make the police accountable. I use the word difficult. Some would say it's impossible, but I'll keep with the term difficult, and we'll discuss in detail what the issues are. Full disclosure, many moons ago, many stones ago, I was a police officer for 12 years in Merseyside Police in the 1980s and 1990s. I am not naive. I don't wear rose-tinted glasses when I view police misconduct. I do not consider the modern police force are properly trained on the law. I was trained in a very old-fashioned way, like you would learn your times tables. I was trained and tested on learning definitions of law that were pertinent to being a policeman in those 1980s and 1990s. And it was effective because I can still rattle them out. I can still rattle out the definition of theft, for example, as theft is dishonest appropriation of property belonging to the other with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it. And I can go on, but I won't. But they're still stuck in the noggin. I do believe that the police have lost the trust of some of the population who are mainly law-abiding, and they are more Robocop than Dixon and Doc Green. Now, people of my age, there are a few, will remember Dixon of Doc Green and how the image of the police in the 60s and 70s was of a friendly neighborhood community police officer who was there to help and protect and didn't have any strange equipment as they do today. So let's have a look at the next slide. My example of Robocop is an example of a British police officer. As you notice, he's armed with a sidearm, he's got a yellow taser, he's got probably a Heckler Koch semi-automatic weapon. He's got bulletproof chest armor and helmet. Would the little girl go over to him and ask for help? What do you think? And then we have what I call the Dixon of Doc Green look, which is how I started my career. Dressed like that and having nothing more than a whistle and a piece of wood which was about that big, maybe that big, and that was it, and a radio that often didn't work. Okay, so let's explore further where the police force is up to nowadays. I have done a recent a master's degree with policing involved in it, so I am up to date with some of the latest statistics, etc. I talk about statistics. I wanted to talk about police complaint statistics 2018 to 2019. There were over 30,000 registered complaints against police, and that is pretty steady. The key issue to highlight is that the number of the current complaints that are upheld is 12%, But that's even worse when you realise that the 12% upheld, the majority of them were resolved locally without any disciplinary action against the officer complained of. And a tiny proportion, way under 1%, results in a police officer being dismissed or jailed. Survey on public confidence in policing, gradually that survey has shown from about 60% confidence in the police force in the 1970s to where we are today, that the level of confidence in the police force is declining. It was 58% in 2014. It's only 47%, and that in relation to the black community. It's not great. A lot of people who do complain are worried about being picked on by the police or victimized, and there's a lot of distrust in policing in general. Now I'm going to look at why I think that is, first recognizing that it wasn't hunky-dory in my day either. It was quite bad then, particularly in the black mixed race communities in Liverpool, like the Toxteth area. There was a lot of distrust in the police after the Toxteth riots, and before, of course, and it was partly justified. There was racism within the police force, and I witnessed some of it. But we will move on. So what do these surveys tell us? Black and mixed ethnicity communities are more sceptical in trusting the police, accountability, and more fearful of being victimized if they complain. They also tend to be the ones that are statistically more likely to have a taser used against them. Lots and lots of different examples of where that community can justifiably point to being treated differently to other communities, and the statistics don't lie. Young people are less likely to be confident in police accountability. Urban areas, people are less likely to be confident in police accountability, and that tends to suggest that the poorer you are, the less likely you are going to trust the police. So if you are middle class or wealthy and you hardly see the police, you're more likely to trust them. Let's talk about the complaints process. The vast majority of complaints against police officers are in fact investigated by the local police force's Department for Professional Standards. So complaints against police are investigated by the police, and that is still the case. The vast majority of complaints are still investigated locally by the Professional Standards Department. You can complain in writing, you can complain online, or you can complain face to face. The complaint is recorded and then given to Professional Standards Department. This is the process. We'll talk about how it's affected in certain ways later in another slide. But the process itself is the complaint goes to professional standards department. They'll try and resolve the complaint informally, and they will investigate the complaint. It's extremely rare for complaints to be upheld. It's unusual for officers to be dismissed as a result of a single complaint, and it's very rare for officers to face criminal action. I want to deal with some of the most common, and these are repeated time and again by people who, in surveys about how their complaint has been dealt with by the professional standards, not in one force, but many forces. And if some officers want to in the below and argue with me about this, I'll refer them to the statistics to back up everything I am saying. One of the complaints, delay. Make the person complaining wait at a police station for hours to complain. There are parochial examples of this on YouTube, where people are made to wait hours. That unfortunately the inspector's not available and the inspector never shows up. It's all designed to make it difficult to complain. They don't get, the people who complain, regular progress reports. They make the complainant push and chase things and take as long as possible to do anything. The time it takes for a simple complaint to be investigated is extremely long. And I argue it's deliberately so. It's a similar tactic to the tactic that is adopted by lawyers in relation to when they are being against the other side, who is the complainant in the case. They will start delay processes and general obstructive processes. It's tactical. Overburden. The second tactic they use is the professional standards will ask for more and more proof and details and questions, and make the complainant work hard to produce evidence that they don't really need, as if they are the ones under investigation and not the officer. And it's designed to make you feel frustrated and to encourage you to give up. It's a common tactic also not to investigate and do things in a rush, losing CCTV from independent sources because they haven't acted to secure it, and loads of examples like that. So obstruction. They also ask, what do you want out of making the complaint? And they encourage the complainant to reduce their expectations and minimize the misconduct issues with the officer to encourage an informal resolution, which, to be honest, isn't even a slap on the wrist. It's just best an acknowledgement that things could have been handled better. It's a fig leaf response. If professional standards do have to actually investigate, then remember the police officer will be allowed legal advice from the Federation and representation. He will be interviewed under caution. He will not have to say anything, and he will almost certainly have legal expense cover through group insurance via the Police Federation. In order to try and stop this or encourage more police accountability, an independent office for police conduct was set up. It wasn't called that originally. It was originally called the IPCC, but I won't get into the acronym chasing. But it's pretty well the same thing. It's a relatively small organisation who's responsible for overseeing how the police handle complaints. It can only really deal with the most serious complaints, and it has to rely, because of its lack of resources, in the police investigating themselves in professional standards. So what do you think of that? That's where we are, and that's the Police and Crime Act 2017, part 5, and there's a link on that page which I will upload. The IOPC can review complaints, and once the complaint has been concluded by the professional standards, but they can only consider on review whether the response was reasonable or proportionate. In other words, you'd have to prove that it was perverse for the decision to be made by the professional standards department. You'd have to prove it was unreasonable, and that's quite a high burden of proof. So suddenly, in the IOPC review process, as a complainant, the burden seems to have been switched, the burden of proof, the other way around. So you effectively have to show in your review that the response from the professional standards department was unreasonable and it wasn't proportionate. The IOPC has limited powers to investigate independently, normally only where there are matters that have potential to affect public confidence in the police, such as deaths and serious injuries, can they actually head the complaint and do their own investigation. And even then, they usually seek the assistance of the professional standards department, either in that force or another force. The role of the police and crime commissioners in complaints against police. Well, the police and crime commissioners are elected, and we will discuss their role at some point or other more fully. They are responsible for appointing the chief constable in the police force you're at. Not quite the same in the Met, but we'll talk about that at another time. They can hire and fire the chief constable. They are responsible for deciding the policy and responsible for supervising complaints in the investigation process as a whole, but not looking at individual complaints. So they have some overseeing responsibility, but not in the nitty-gritty of each complaint. The police crime commissioners can decide to become more involved in complaints against police by adopting a different approach. So the legislature allows them to choose from two options. I don't really intend to go through those options at the moment, because the majority of police and crime commissioners have adopted the review approach, only to consider whether appeals were reasonable or proportionate. In option 2, there's a lot more requirement for them to become involved, and they're not funded, and they don't have the necessary resources to do that. So the vast majority have adopted option 1, which is to oversee the policy approach and to review how police complaints are dealt with. As you can see on this slide, I reflect that by talking about and commenting on how small the commissioners' teams are and how unrealistic it is to expect them to adopt anything other than a overseeing role and a policy-based approach. I emphasize on the next slide, this is my personal opinion, based on some experience, but a long time ago, based on my observation and recent studies. Criticism number 1, the public do not interact with police. It's difficult to report crime face to face. Lots of police stations are closed to the public and police numbers have declined. There are less and less opportunities for the public to speak directly face to face with the police in an informal way. The way the police are dressed, second issue, makes them unapproachable. They're armed with pepper spray, asps, bar-handled cuffs, tasers. They are wearing paramilitary style clothing. Majority of officers do not wear hats, are dressed in black and are dressed in a military style. Some officers have taken to wearing black Union Jacks with a thin blue line on it. And they see themselves as the thin blue line, as victims, as under siege by the public or a large part of the public. So they dress themselves up in victimhood. In reality, the police force name suggests what the police force is. The police force has huge resources. If any of you can remember the miners' strike and how the police force is deployed in what were called PSUs, police support units of 12 officers in a van, going down the motorways, meeting up with other officers, the officers at home, doing 12-hour shift to cover so there was extra staff, and they could turn up and you only have to type into your internet Orgreave, and I was there, you only have to type up Orgreave or miners' strike and you can see hundreds of police officers dressed with riot gear on, and that was in the 1980s. And that ability to react still exists. So the idea that the police force are a small, tiny, and they're not a force isn't true. So why do the police feel like they're under siege? And why do they think it's appropriate to wander around with no hats on, not in uniform, and in some cases abusing members of the public who they distrust or don't like if they have been filmed. You only have to look on YouTube for myriad examples of police officers behaving inappropriately with people filming them. So why are they doing that? I loathe that the police constables are being allowed to wander around with a political message on their uniforms. A black Union Jack with a thin blue line through it. The thin blue line idea originated on the American flag, and it was a response to Black Lives Matter. It's openly political. It's openly a right wing and political. The argument is for a charitable purpose. It may give money to police charities, but it is saying something about the officers' view of the society they police. It's not inclusive. It's an expression of victimhood, and it shows how out of touch the police are with the community. They are members of the community, and they should not be isolating themselves from that community by separating themselves as a wall of blue, the thin blue line. That isn't appropriate. Why are the senior officers, chief constables, and the inspectors, chief inspectors, superintendents, etc., allowing officers to wander around on the streets with these badges when lots of communities feel insulted by that badge and recognise it as a political badge? One of the Peelian principles is that, from Sir Robert Peel's, when he introduced the police force in the Met in 1829, was that the police should be apolitical and non-political and should be part of the community, and he rejected them dressing like the army. So let's look at some of the problems with complaining about police conduct. Code of silence. Not grassing up your colleague. Saying nothing. Tolerating poor behaviour even if you disagree with it. There is a culture of silence or protection of colleagues within the police force. Poor and biased investigation, because it's more the standards, professional standards, and other investigators are more concerned with protecting the image of that particular police force and are concerned not to be seen to tolerate poor behaviour. So what they tend to do is find against it and say, oh no, there's nothing to see here, move on, move on. Failing to take appropriate action when evidence justifies it. We have myriad examples like Hillsborough and many others of delays, refusal to accept reality, unwillingness to accept fault. I mean, the Stephen Lawrence inquiries, labelling complainers as troublemakers, or even investigating the complainers. Again, Stephen Lawrence examples and many other examples. And the latest IOPC statistics support this. Now, the IOPC has its own problems because it's been under-resourced. Professional standards have huge resources. All the different forces have a professional standards department. There is only one IOPC. So they are outnumbered with resources and staffing, experienced investigators. They have to use or have had to use police investigators who've retired or left the police force, or as opposed to training up their own investigators. The IOPC doesn't have the same powers as the police when they're collecting evidence, and the police federation and the local police forces, if they don't cooperate willingly with the IOPC, can delay matters, and sometimes for years. And we all know, or we should know, the maxim, justice delayed is justice denied. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, please, to this channel, Law Rights and All That. We're on Facebook. You can like us. And we're also on the internet. Thanks for listening. Bye.